Hey guys, welcome to a new episode of Making the Rounds. We are going to talk a little bit about an interesting topic that has come up on Twitter a lot and just seems to be all over the place, which is what has happened to the import appetites in a lot of the regions around the world. Because we see the import appetite, or fewer teams importing in teams like Europe, regions like Europe, and North America hasn't imported new Korean players. We also had teams without imports do fairly well from major regions at Worlds recently. So the question becomes like, why are regions like LMS and Brazil and Turkey suddenly looking to Korean imports again when they weren't necessarily as initially successful within the regions? So we're going to bring on Nelson as a guest because he works for Hong Kong Attitude, and that was one of the teams that I think brought in a few Koreans toward the end of this year in 2017 and like looked a lot at the Korean ladder, so I thought he would have interesting perspective and input to add. So hello Nelson, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing fine. Just Happy New Year, everyone.
Woo. Okay, so the first topic I think region we should look at is Turkey, because they're the ones that seem to have the most interest in importing some of the really big Korean names. Like, you have all sorts of Korean mid laners coming in. You have Coco, you have GBM. There's a really long list in general. So I think the question becomes, and then a lot of people are bringing in mids and jungles, right? And so immediately when I look at all of these teams that are bringing in Korean mid laners, I think of like the success of Frozen and Fenerbahce. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think it's like entirely, I think it's entirely Frozen, because Turkey isn't a region that typically focused a lot on importing Korean players. They'd import a lot of European players and have since about like 2015. But in terms of Korean players, there was just Reach and he was known as Fencer back then, but it's Sword, the top laner for Griffin. Um, and then Frozen and Reach were on the same team. Reach is not that great of a jungler. And then Move obviously was on the team that brought them to the World Championship, even though he didn't play. But I definitely think the fact that Fenerbahce ended up being so successful with Frozen and Move is why you see so many of these teams suddenly willing to get like all the Koreans. I feel like I've heard more Korean roster announcements from Turkey than I have like Turkish players.
Yeah, and I think that's also partly because we have English speaking Twitter accounts. We follow mostly English speaking people, and so people will tailor their news to be like, oh, this Turkish team has announced their full roster. It includes these Korean players, because that tends to be what the Western English speaking scene cares a little bit more about than the Turkish. Whereas I think Turkish news outlets would probably highlight players that
Yeah.
are going to be familiar to the scene as well. So, do you think that it's a good move, I guess, for a region like Turkey to react like this? Because in a lot of the major regions, and this is going to be a more overarching topic throughout the show, is that the regions that are importing more right now, I feel like, are ones that we think of as having maybe a naturally smaller talent base than some of the major regions. Other than, obviously, LMS is a major region, but yes. So do you think that it's a good move for Turkey to import Korean players then, from that perspective, or?
think I think like the situation in Turkey and LMS is similar to like at the end of season 4, where it's like there are a whole bunch of Korean players, and since right now China they won't take in new Korean players mainly because of the language issue. And then for NA, it's kind of set like which other Korean players are going to play in NA. And for EU, they're mainly using the same imports over and over again. So what happens to the rest? So they will probably go to a place with the most money, which is kind of is Turkey right now.
And a lot of these imports have been from teams in other regions, right, that have been imported already. Like Coco was on Newbie for a while and things like this.
Yeah, it's Coco, Wisdom, Cacao, Rain. I guess Mar and Incepted and Snowflower are exceptions, but like even Move went to Machi.
Yeah.
It's a lot of like Nahyun is still there. So yeah, it's a lot of Korean players that were on non-Korean teams.
Do you think that someone who has looked at Korean imports before, does that make them more appealing? Do you think that they've been on other teams before that aren't Korean and that they kind of know that they won't be in the same environment, or?
I mean, it depends. No, you can go first.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say it always depends on the player. Like, I think one of the reasons why Frozen and Move ended up working out is that Move's style really played to Frozen specifically, and also Frozen himself is kind of an outgoing guy. That team also had Thaldrin, who I think is like, I know I keep bringing him up whenever I talk about this team, but like I feel like he's so underrated in terms of like team leadership and just how many teams he's led to the international stage. Excuse me, sorry. From Turkey. So I think it always depends on the player.
Also, you mentioned language barrier earlier. Nelson, my understanding, based on talking mostly to Clement, is that within the LMS, the language barrier issue is always kind of prohibitive, or something that they really wanted to emphasize in terms of a reason they wouldn't import Korean players. Whereas I think that this way of thinking has become really new in the LPL. A lot of teams are thinking, in particular because of Royals being successful, and Royal the entire time saying we all speak one language, this is why our communication is good, this is why our coaching is good, this is why we're able to perform very well. So I was wondering, like, why, in light of that, the LMS perception may have changed a little bit.
I don't think the other teams were thinking about it when they made those moves, because I think for HK we learned it the hard way. Like, we signed 3 Koreans. So basically we signed one who was like 900 points on the challenger ladder, and then was like 600 or 700 points, but it was really hard to integrate them into the team because they can't even speak Chinese.
Right.
And the reason why Riris was like so successful because he was in China for like 2 or 3 years, I think. Yeah, and he can speak Chinese like fluently, like even on a day-to-day basis, he can speak Chinese. So it's like if you throw him on the streets in Taiwan, he could still like find his way back.
I've heard that's like the fundamental gap that a lot of Korean players have when they go to China or somewhere else. Where they'll be able to maybe communicate some game terms, but they will have no idea how to order a taxi, which I think.
Yes, I mean, even like if you want to talk about like in game, even something as simple as like let's coordinate a minion wave so that they crash together in the tower at the same time in 2 different lanes. Like, most players can't say that in Chinese. Sure. Most Korean players can't, yeah.
So, I guess that's from your perspective. I've heard Flash Wolves, Flash Wolves to me is interesting because I heard Flash Wolves are looking at a Korean jungler. And before they had that Korean 80 carry in 2015, and they were pretty vocal, to my understanding, that it didn't work out because of the language barrier in particular, and they ended up bringing an L back and everything else related to that, and did actually very well at Worlds that year. Do you know anything about why their perception may have changed in that regard after losing Karsa, or?
I think back then when they had Kramer, it was because Kramer was he was like kind of a new player. Like, he didn't have much pro experience, and I think the difference is that if you are a player with like 3 or 4 years experience, that doesn't matter whether you can speak the language. You should be able to know like what to do in the game. So that language shouldn't be such a huge issue.
Okay. So
I think that's mainly like for the AD carry role, but for other roles it's kind of more difficult.
Emily, are we also seeing like in Brazil teams being more interested now in bringing over Korean players that have more experience than maybe they had in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Brazil is kind of weird because they pretty much until this preseason swore off Korean players. After the whole thing with Cade in 2014, and then in 2015 they had Winged and Suno, and then they had Emperor and Daydream, and neither of those teams made it. They both got beaten by different all Brazilian lineups. So um, that's when Brazil kind of swore off imports, and the only really successful import was Dade, who is some French support that like his Portuguese is fluent at this point. Like people joke that his Brazilian Portuguese is better than native Brazilians. And if you look at who is coming back to Brazil, I mean, it's still very surprising to me that they're taking so many risks on imports because I still felt like they were kind of done with it. But you have Jisoo coming in, who I guess, a little bit worried about. I've heard he's pretty quiet. And Sky, who's the other one that I'm unsure because I don't I don't know how well he communicates. But then you also have Winged, who again was already on Cade. You have Lacti, who was on Pain. So you do have a few of the Koreans that they're picking up actually have played in Brazil before.
Okay. So I guess in that sense, how much do you think results sort of dictated in the past Brazil and LMS not necessarily wanting to import Koreans? So initially, the first experiments kind of failed, and then now they're seeing in other regions like Turkey or something else where teams with Koreans have had some success, so they're willing to try it again after time.
Yeah, I mean, I was still pretty surprised because I do think it's entirely results based. Like when other teams found that they could just have all Brazilian lineups, they didn't have to worry about a language barrier thing. They didn't have to worry about players adjusting to the culture. And again, it always depends on the player. Like someone like Dayoud who's coming in, he's a little bit older, like just in age, and he's just already a little bit more mature. I'm using an example. He's obviously not Korean, but like in terms of the kind of right personality you have to be a successful import, he's willing to learn the language. He adjusts to the culture very quickly. Whereas I know all of the imports in that first wave, they did say that they had a really hard time. You then have the example of Crown, where he had a really, really difficult time in Brazil. The team he was on was kind of sketchy, but he had a really difficult time adjusting and wasn't given any support to adjust initially. So I think it depends on the player's personality and how willing they are to adapt as well, if that makes sense.
I think for LMS, it's like almost every team will have imports. So yeah, but I think most of them they don't. They're how do I say? They're just signing players who are like high on the challenger ladder, and that was the mistake we made last season.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think communication is extremely important, and that's why for this season we're just looking at players who used to play in China. Otherwise, like they wouldn't even be considered.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
you said that you think that that was a mistake you made last year. My understanding is that Tabe was pretty vocal when he came in to coach HKA about wanting to have the player who was highest on the Korean ladder play for the team, and they went. He called it almost like a solo queue-esque style that you wanted to just have like very skilled players in that sense. You said that you think like what made you realize or made your team think that that was ultimately a mistake?
I think the number one was like for the Taiwanese players, their English was too horrible, so we couldn't communicate in English. And then we thought that we could get a Chinese Korean speaking teacher for the Korean players, but they can't seem to be able to pick up the language. So that's what we learned last year.
Do you think that other teams are kind of looking at the HKA model and applying it without like looking at the lessons that you learned, or is it some other factor that's motivating them to import Koreans?
I think it's also because like there's a huge influx of investments in the LMS.
Okay.
Like more celebrities and more large companies are starting to invest, and the best way to make a splash is just to sign a big name Korean player.
So do you think the LMS is kind of going through some of the same growing pains as NA franchising, where you're having like a lot of new money coming in, or?
I think it's something like that, and also it seems like it's like China right now, where we can sign Korean imports, so let's just sign everyone who we can get. I mean, back in Season 5, I mean.
Yeah. So it was just kind of a delay because the LMS didn't have money as much. Like, what is leading to this new investment? Because this is an interesting question as well.
Because actually, I'm not too sure either, but I think I hear about like rumors about franchising coming the LMS, but not really sure when.
It makes sense, right? Because almost every region is talking about franchising. So, I guess in that regard, now since we should transition back to the topic that Emily brought back up, which is how do you kind of tell whether or not an import will be successful? And do you think that with this new round of imports, people are looking more at some of the intangible qualities as opposed to just like blindly signing all the time?
I mean, I hope they are. I don't actually know. Like,
okay, fair enough.
So here's the thing. Like, I can't look at these signings and say with certainty that they're done like because someone did a really good job scouting this player or whatever. For another example, I think Winged could end up being good because he's already played and he also was very well liked as a person. So again, like, I think one thing I would look out for in an import, like outside of obvious stuff like in-game talent, would be just do they have an outgoing, gregarious kind of personality? Because I think you need that to be able to kind of just bulldoze your way through culture shock and all of this other stuff that happens when you move to a different country. So I think like Winged returning to Brazil, he could end up being good. I was surprised. So like looking at another jungler in Turkey, I was surprised that Cacao got picked up. Not because he's not good, but because I know I talked to people from when he was on Misfits, and they were like, he's still really good. He's still really talented, but I think he'd do so much better where he can communicate on a Korean team. And so that kind of surprised me, that he was picked up. So I don't know, like, I can't say in good faith that like a ton of scouting has been done on intangibles, or maybe they see something in Cacao's personality that's changed that I haven't seen, obviously. But to point out a pickup that I was actually surprised about, that was one just because I had heard that a lot of people were like, oh, he'd do so much better on a team where he can just naturally communicate with his teammates rather than having to worry about a language barrier.
And Nelson, you said that in looking at players, you were only looking at players who have played in China before, right? So is language going to be your number one thing? And after that, what do you look at?
I think it depends like what role you are looking at and what we need the roles to do. Like maybe do we need like a carry, or do we need like a shot caller, a shot calling type of player? But I think language is the most important, and I think the issues which you mentioned earlier, it's actually quite easily solved. Like even if you can't scout like 100% correctly, why wouldn't you just bring the player out, fly out to your country for a month and trial him then? I'm not sure why none of the teams are doing that.
Yeah, there are a lot of teams that just don't do that. Even in even in
that's what we do. That's why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or theoretically, they have a ton of money to do things like that hasn't really gotten done in the past. So I'm also surprised, but I'm glad to hear that you guys at least are doing that.
Yeah, I mean it's better to cut your losses earlier
instead of just say, "Oh, you're number 3 on the ladder. Why hasn't anyone signed you? Here, have some money."
Yeah,
have a ton of money.
Let's sign you for a year, and you can just play PUBG all day.
for
Yeah,
sure.
I think the closest I've heard of teams doing that is like NA and EU teams when they do boot camping,
Hmm.
but it's always like in Korea.
Right.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Um,
kind of
like they
cheap.
might trial players while they're in Korea boot camping in off season. That's the closest I've ever heard to people doing like a trial thing, and even then, it doesn't really get to the culture shock aspect um, or how they'll act in like a different environment outside of Korea.
I mean, because I think those boot camps are like 2 or 3 weeks, right? So, and the players don't usually stay with you.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Also, how do you kind of get over when you are trying out players, how do you get over what people in EU have described as, not even with imports, but just this idea that the player will communicate like 10 times more, will try 10 times harder than they will if they're already signed, right? How do you kind of see through
If
the ultra try hard to see what kind of player you're actually going to get? Because if the player is like super motivated to get signed, he won't necessarily play the same way he will once he's already signed, right?
mm, I think because we will test the players like multiple times, and if we think he's okay, we'll fly him over for a trial, like on-site trial. And I believe like after a month when he stays here, we should be able to figure out like whether is he really super motivated to actually win, or is he like just here to get the contract.
So you actually try them out for as much as a month, you said? Or
Yeah, we test them online first, and then we fly them over.
okay, that's
Yeah.
pretty good. Yeah. So I guess because for me in the past I've always looked at the import process, or people looking at imports as gut reacting and saying, okay, we want this player because he's Korean. We think that Korean players are the best. Do we feel like, obviously, we can't speak as intelligently about what's going on in Turkey, but do we feel like that's happening in LMS in Brazil?
I think that's what what the owners in LMS are thinking of, because if you look at the players in LMS, we are basically recycling the same old players over and over
Mm-hmm.
again. But I think that statement isn't like 100% true that Korean players are always better, because it depends who you get.
Yeah, I agree that
Yeah.
that statement isn't
Yeah.
true.
Because like most of the newer Korean players, or the players from the Korean challenger scene, they won't be as good as like players who have played for 4 or 5 years. Because yeah, the newer players, they wouldn't even understand like basic macro as well, because they don't learn that in the challenger scene.
It's also a lot harder, I would guess, to teach new Korean players macro because if your coach doesn't speak Korean as well, I assume.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think for us, we got lucky with Riris, because he used to play in LCK, and basically he can teach like every single player in our team like what they should do in their own role.
yeah,
And
that's.
yeah, and I don't think most of the players can do that. And those who can do that, they are probably like in China.
I think for EU fans, probably the best example would be Ryu was really successful in
Yeah,
H2K because he had so much experience, and he,
yeah.
even though he spoke like no English, he knew what he was supposed to do, and he was active in trying to have an input in scrims, so he eventually learned English anyway. Whereas someone like Nuclear and Che, they weren't as experienced, and they ended up not working out as well in that regard because they had to be taught some things, and it wasn't immediate. So I guess, yeah, I agree that Korean players are not automatically better, and I feel like some of the results of this Worlds demonstrated that the issues that teams are having in terms of gaps between Korean teams and the rest of the world aren't simply because of the individual skill levels of the players. However, I've talked to people who are involved in some of the wild card or emerging regions, and some of these people, I'm not necessarily in the Brazilian or Turkish scene, think that just their server size is so small that you have to import to bridge any kind of talent gap. And so that's why I'm thinking this sort of mentality is motivating some of the Turkish or the Brazilian or the LMS scene to import more. I guess let's put it this way. Emily, what do you think? Do you think that Brazilian talent can get to a point where it is a competitive major region?
So the main thing, in my opinion, that's actually keeping Brazil back is just internet infrastructure.
Okay.
And unfortunately, that's not something that the player base has control over. One thing that people might not know is that Brazil's actual raw player base is
the same size
massive,
as NA, right?
Yeah, it's pretty big. And the problem is that just the average household in Brazil is not going to have the greatest internet connection. And Brazilian internet, even in I remember when teams were first setting up gaming houses, and they would always complain that their internet sucked. And that's not a them thing; it's a Brazilian internet thing. So that's something that's very hard to fix. I do think that Brazil in general, even though some of these imports surprised me, mainly Jisoo to Flamengo, which is a new, they're sponsored by a major sports team, yeah, but they're new in CBLoL and in esports, and so I think that Jisoo to Flamengo was the only really weird one to me outside of Sky, because again, like I said previously, I can definitely see why people would pick up Winged and Lacti to come to Brazil again. I do think it's kind of split in terms of the attitude from talking to people. I've talked to people who think, including I had an interview with Daoud where I was talking to him about imports, and he's like honestly, I think the main thing is coaching. That was his big thing. He's like, I actually think Brazil has the player base. I think they're really talented people, but I don't think there's enough Brazilians that know macro or finer points of how to play the game itself at a competitive level to be able to teach the teams. And then so even some imports in Brazil feel like Brazil's player base is totally fine, and it's just a matter of teaching players what to do. And the most successful Brazilian teams have been all Brazilian. So that also helps, right? Because there's never been a time when a hybrid roster has done really well outside of within the regular season. So anytime Brazil has had international success, it's always been with an all-Brazilian lineup pretty much. So I think that's also really important as to why the attitudes are kind of still split, where most players are just like, yeah, our player base is fine, we just need to learn how to play the game. And then I've also talked to people from Brazil who do think that there's not enough people at the top because of the internet issues, and that's why they might need to import players.
And obviously the question isn't the same for the LMS, because I always think of the LMS as kind of weird, and the best example against the just raw server base argument, right? Which is because the server size of the LMS region in Garena is really not that large, but they've managed to produce teams that can take games, or sometimes even more than games, off of Korean teams, but it will always be one or two teams. So some people have theorized that for the LMS to be really competitive, it's just not within the server's capability to produce 2 or 3 or 4 teams that are consistently doing super well or super high level all the time. But at the same time, I think HKA was doing fairly well. You had sort of a little bit of a debate about whether or not HQ or HKA were the second or third best team, which was shocking for a lot of commentators who didn't think that LMS would necessarily be able to produce a third strong team for Worlds. Do you think that it's possible do you think that LMS's server side is always going to hold it back, or?
I think so, but I think the difference is LMS, they have the teams over there, they have access to the players in Southeast Asia as well.
Right.
So if any LMS teams want like they really want to look at players nearby, so they could look at like Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and for Singapore and Malaysia, it's more easier for those players to speak Chinese because they learn it in school. But it seems like other than Chowie and like Becky, there are no other players who are actually good enough to play in LMS. And I think the situation in LMS and Brazil is different because for Brazil, like, you know, the internet issues, and I think it's the lack of the Korean server.
Yeah.
Because like since everyone in LMS plays on the Korean server, so it's quite clear like how good our players are. You can just check on the ladder rankings, like you will know how good they are. Like you can see like Karsas for that, they're always like 600, 700, 800 points. Maple is like he hovers around there as well. So it's pretty clear how good the players are, and if the players can't reach as high on the challenger ladder, it means it just says that they're not good enough.
Yeah, and Brazil has a bit of a difficulty because the best they can do is play on the NA server, which is notoriously
That's bad.
Yeah, good.
It's
so
and also so like I've played the reverse. I played on the Brazilian server, and the ping is still pretty ridiculous.
Yeah.
Pretty ridiculous. But yeah, that was one thing I forgot to mention. So thank you for bringing that up. Brazil does not have a good ladder like to play on. They're pretty locked into playing on their own server.
There was a rumor for a while, and I even talked to Stake a little bit about this at Worlds when I interviewed him, that Riot were going to not allow LMS and LPL players to play on the Korean ladder anymore, or the Korean server anymore. I haven't heard as much about this since then. Do you know if that's still happening, or can you comment on that?
From what I know, the LPL teams they aren't given Korean accounts anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think that's about it. I think because the LMS teams they still practice on the Korean server.
Okay, because
but not the LPL teams.
I remember talking to Stake about it, and he was really kind of pessimistic about the idea of LMS teams not being able to compete on the Korean server, and thinking that it will make them much worse if that happens. So
yeah, definitely, because I think we would have to play on the Challenger server in China. Yeah, and the server, and I played on that server during Worlds, and I got 60% win rate there. So it's kind of bad.
Yeah, it's a little bit disappointing that the Challenger server in China is not very good, but there are so many issues with Chinese solo queue that we probably shouldn't necessarily get into right now. So I guess ultimately it comes down to, like, were you surprised that this ended up happening in the off season? Because we had the results of the World Championship. Fnatic did pretty well among the European teams. You had RNG looking the best among the Chinese teams. There's only one Korean import on Misfits. And these teams were having like probably one of the better showings that we've seen foreign regions have against Korean teams in a really long time. So I was just kind of curious if you guys were surprised that the Korean import appetite increased selectively in these other regions.
I think for LMS, I wasn't really expecting it because like I kind of know most of the players, like how much they're asking for, their salary, and in my mind it was like like the LMS teams, they won't have enough money to pay for it. But yeah, but that wasn't the case. It seems like everyone has more money than us right now because they're signing like Stitch and Candy, and pretty sure those are pretty expensive players.
I think it is partly an issue with, okay, you have so much money, what do you do with it? And the immediate response is, oh, well, people say that these players are good. And without doing like extra research, it's almost always the default gut reaction is to just import Korean players, right? So that kind of makes me a little pessimistic about Turkey in particular, and looking at some of the big names that they're importing. And I know that some of the teams that just chose to replace their mid because Frozen was a Korean mid, and that team was successful, even though they had like one of the better Turkish mids. So I was a little bit I'm really nervous about Turkey in particular. I'm nervous about just a lot of this. But I do think it's interesting to see Europe not import new Korean players. And
I mean,
like a lot of the teams,
there's like Rocket.
yeah, they basically don't have a ton of Korean imports on the EU teams right now anymore. And I didn't import any new Korean players, even though I expected way more European imports on the NA rosters actually, but they didn't import any new ones. They're still investing in Koreans learning English, and they think that that's way more important. You have LPL teams also not importing new Korean players. Some teams are going with like one, or RNG's stayed all Chinese speaking. We'll say that to avoid immediate issues. But
Immediate backlash.
I still think Brazil is pretty heavily dictated by all Brazilian lineups, and you saw the biggest roster move, even though the Sky Winged thing was a surprise. I think the biggest roster move was actually the fact that the old INTZ roster is reforming, because they were kind of Brazil's top roster for a year and a half, I'd say. So I think that was kind of the major off-season move. No one was really surprised about it. I think most people saw it coming, but it still tells me that Brazil is still really focused on trying to develop their native talent first, which is good. For Turkey, I think they're undergoing the kind of thing that China already went through, that Europe to some extent went through, where it's like, let's get all of the Korean players.
That's what LMS is going through as well.
Yeah, so I think how successful those teams do will then dictate what happens in Turkey next, just as Frozen's success has dictated what is happening now.
I guess, as we already learned from North America last year, it's you can't just look at China and what happened in China and decide to learn from another region's mistakes. You have to actually go through it yourself. So I think that seems
to
be
make those mistakes yourself.
The general consensus is we're a bit pessimistic about this. Go ahead.
Because I think like in China, there's like if you're a new Korean player and you come over to China, you need to learn Chinese. Mm-hmm. And I remember, if I'm not wrong, like I heard about some players, they have like, oh, like maybe do you want 50, 60, 70K a month? Then the owner would be like, yeah, we can give it to you if you can speak Chinese. So they would have to speak Chinese.
Yeah, now they really do, but I think it was like for 2 years where Mandarin Chinese speaking lessons were really not emphasized. It was weird because after 2015, you had EDG suddenly giving Mandarin Chinese lessons to Pawn, and you saw stuff on the board that was like really, really basic. Like, this is how you say what? This is how you say the, or I guess not the, but this is how you say, like, is, or whatever, and it was just very weird. Anyway, so it was...
I think it would be harder for the Taiwanese teams to catch up on that, because like the way they learn Chinese in Taiwan and China is a lot different. Right. Yeah, and like, the way they learn Chinese in China is like they use English letters. Yeah. So it's easier to learn, but not in Taiwan. So yeah, not in Taiwan.
Well, so before we go, since I've kept you guys for a while, I want you both to give me one Korean import in any of these regions any region at all that you think is a good import decision, and one that you are not really optimistic about at all.
Does it have to be like a new import?
No. Go for it.
Okay. I think for me it would be Rocket. They have Blank and Profit. Mm-hmm. Okay. If I'm wrong, yeah. I think they are one of the most underrated rosters, and I think they would probably be like top 4 at the end of the split.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, because we have also actually practiced against them. And every other team which went to Korea, and they're the best. So
it's interesting because I really am not high on Profit after watching him on
Yep. Yeah.
Nip, yes, Ninjas in Pajamas, but we'll see how he does, I guess. So I think that there are a lot of really good top laners in Europe, so I think it's a weird role to import. But
And I think for the biggest like disappointment would probably be, I would say, like for Amici, for like Machi.
Machi, okay.
Yeah, because I mean I know all the players, they can't speak English, and I doubt their Korean imports can really speak Chinese as well. And from what I know, they have some infrastructure issues, like with their coaching and management stuff.
Machi is an interesting team because you can see them sort of hitting a certain ceiling, but then they do really ridiculous things that don't make any sense, or they just sort of implode. So there has to be
it's usually
something
like
going on. Yeah.
And it's usually like you assign like hard carry Korean players, but they signed like a jungler who is most known like for putting wards, and and an AD carry, and an AD carry who was relegated. So unless he can like short call in Chinese, I doubt like he would do well.
Sure. So Emily?
I'll pick two from Brazil. I actually think, like I said before, for the reasons that I also stated before, I won't go through them again just to not repeat myself. But I think Winged could work out. On the flip side, on that same team, I'm actually really curious about Sky. He didn't impress me when he was a mid laner on CJ. I thought he was actually not good, and we're all waiting for BDD to come in. And when BDD did come in, it just turned out that he was really raw and didn't communicate with the team as well. So I thought it was interesting that Sky kind of, whether it was deserved or not, gained a reputation for being a fairly good communicator and kind of just an easy mage playing mid who can kind of shove out mid, so that CJ could continue to focus bot and cover up for the fact that their jungler was also not great. The CJ team was kind of a mess, so I'm not sure how much to blame Sky for that, but then he was obviously on the bench for SKT behind Faker, who obviously that's a weird position to be in always. It's always weird when a Korean player who didn't necessarily get a chance to impress and he's been playing for a while, but he hasn't really had a lot of good professional experience, so I'd be a little bit concerned about bringing him on a roster. He's also not ever played in Brazil before, where Winged has, so that's kind of a weird question mark pickup that I'm looking at, and I'm just kind of curious to see how it turns out.
So is that both of those? So Winged is the one that you're optimistic about, and Sky is
Sky is the one that I'm pessimistic about. Which, weirdly enough, they're on the same team. So if one of them ends up sucking, then the team will end up sucking. But
maybe that was the strategy: is that we're pretty sure Winged will work out, and then maybe he can like keep Sky in line. I'm not really optimistic about any of the Korean imports. I'm just gonna be transparent about that until I start hearing more teams consistently saying stuff like Nelson just did, which was, yeah, we brought them out for a month to make sure that they worked. Then I'm just gonna continue to just be sort of, because I do think that as long as you have a certain server size, as long as you can produce one good team, you can have a major impact on the region. Generally, I think is what we've seen so far, and I think that a lot of what is holding emerging regions back is going to be things like coaching staff and just development in infrastructure, and when I say that, I don't mean money, because money usually doesn't always help. So I'm not really optimistic about any, so it was a trick question. Anyway, thank you guys for joining me, and I hope everyone who watched at least learned something. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.